So I think we're good. I think we're up and working. If everybody's here, this is the Help Network Academy. My name's Brian Schmidt, and today they've invited me to do a guest lecture on the business side of working in game sound and music. So I'll just start right up. Okay, thanks very much. My name is Brian Schmidt. I've been doing game sound for about 34 years now. Started in '87. Run a conference called Game Sound Con. I'm also president of the Game Audio Network Guild. It's been very interesting to see how the game music industry has changed, and the business side has changed over the decades that I've been in the industry. So I'm excited to share some of that with you here today. So the first thing I'd like to do is get one of my pet peeves about when people talk about the business of game audio is just the size of the industry in general. It's been reported for about almost 20 years now that the video game industry is bigger than the movie industry. Again, Bill Gates said that in 60 Minutes in 2003, and it continues to be propagated. And it's certainly true that the game industry is huge, but one thing I want to make clear is that people should go into it with a little bit more skepticism. Generally, when people say, the game industry is, 3 times bigger than movies and 5 times bigger than music or whatever, they are generally comparing the motion picture box office numbers, which is ticket sales, to the entirety of the video game industry, including Xboxes and PlayStations and hardware. So these things are left out of what they call the movie industry. No Netflix, no Stars, no network TV, no DVD, Blu-ray sales, no Blu-ray player sales, no theater projection sales, and that makes it a bit of an unfair comparison. So adding everything up, if you compare the movie box office to the video game industry, yes, you're correct. The video game industry is much larger. However, this chart, by the way, is the U.S. Because the number, it's easier to get pretty good data on the U.S. size of the U.S. industries. We can see the movie box office, a little over $10 billion a year. That was 2019. Game software sales are about $35 billion, definitely much more. You add in Xboxes and PlayStations and gaming mice, and that adds another about $6 billion. But what that still doesn't leave out is the non-box office revenue that movies make from disc sales, streaming media, and so on. And that really makes the industries a lot more comparable. So are games bigger than movies? Actually, yeah, by now they probably are, but it's not this orders of magnitude bigger thing that I think sometimes people seem to get, or people like to report. Also, by the way, these numbers here on box office plus disc, that doesn't include YouTube. YouTube's revenue last year was $15 billion, about 3.5 of which were in the U.S. alone. So again, traditional visual media and games are both really big. It's not like games are way bigger than these other media. And part of that, again, like I mentioned, is that video games are a really broad term. And the kinds of games that, the kind of products that people talk about when they talk about video games really range from everything from a major blockbuster like The Last of Us or Destiny 2 or Red Dead Redemption, something like that, to casual games like, Harry Potter Puzzles and Spells or Candy Crush Saga, or indie games like Untitled Goose Game or Cuphead, and even arcade games, pinball machines, slot machines, and tiny independent games like 100 Floors and so on. So it's really a very, very broad industry. And for that reason, it can be a little bit difficult to determine what actually is meant by the business of video games, because frankly, as you would expect, the business of doing sound or music for The Last of Us Part 2 is going to be very different from the business of music and sound for Untitled Goose Game, or even a major publisher like Zynga doing a Harry Potter game. They're just very different kinds of businesses. But so I'll try to cover kind of in broad scopes what's going on. And the term we use for these kind of games varies. Usually when we're talking about the big titles, the blockbuster titles, those are, we call those AAA titles in the industry. Big budget, large teams, 500 people taking 4 years to develop, very, very big projects. At the other end, of course, you've got independently developed games now, casual published games. A group of a handful of people get together, put some serious effort into it, and self-publish. In the middle are these mid-core games that are, they're not the big titles, but they might take a team of 25 to 50 people over the course of 9 to 12 months to pull out that kind of game. So that's what we mean when we're talking about these different scales of games. Now, in the beginning, it was working on game music or sound was very, very simple. You became an employee of a game company. In fact, as recently as the mid-90s, almost all of the game music and sound were created by in-house employees at these companies. Certainly when I started in 87, almost all of them were. I went freelance in 89, and there were only a handful of us. And part of that was there were these weird arcane skill sets needed. It's a very niche thing. You couldn't just go into a studio and start recording, your soundtrack. You couldn't even do proper Foley. There just was, the technology there was not there. But that did change in a big way, kind of starting in the mid-90s with the original PlayStation, but really hitting in 2001 with the introduction of the DVD as the format that games were on. That really was the point where across the board you could simply go into a studio, and whatever you can do in a studio you can stick into a game now. And that really changed the dynamic of working in the industry. Again, prior to that, game company, composers and sound designers for games were employees of game companies. I remember going to visit Sega in Tokyo, and they had a room with a whole bunch of cubicles with composers with headphones and keyboards composing music for their arcade games. It almost looked like an office environment, not a professional studio. That obviously changed starting once we could ship games on DVD. Then the freelance community kind of took off. And you could hire, as a game company, you could hire just about any composer you want, because they no longer had these, you no longer needed these weird arcane skills for the most part, and we'll get to that. So what is the breakdown currently? It's roughly 50-50. This is taken from a survey of the industry we do every year at GameSoundCon in terms of, for people working in this industry, are they employees? Are they freelancers? How does that break down? And roughly a little over half of people who work in the industry are employees of companies. Again, think Microsoft, Amazon, Riot, Blizzard, Bungie. All these companies have in-house people they pay. And about a little more than half are freelancers. So they're, you set up shop, you're a work for hire person, hired on a project by project basis. There is some overlap because it turns out that there's a pretty, and I was kind of surprised by this myself, there is a decent sized chunk that work for a company but then also do some freelance work on the side. So it's a very dynamic industry. So first we're going to talk about the employee work, and then we're going to switch to freelancers and spend a little bit more time on them. So if you're an employee of a job company, an employee of a game company, or an employee of an audio company doing work for games, what kind of work are you going to be doing? The bulk of it, as you can see from the bar there, is sound design. That's by far the biggest role that an employee of a game company would have in the audio department. About a third of them also are going to compose music. There's some other technical things here in terms of integration, putting the sounds into the games that can get very, very technical. And an interesting note here is that of the people who do games, only about 2% only do music as an employee of a game company. And again, these are some big companies, Riot, Blizzard, Bungie. They have full-time composers where that's about all they do. But it's really relatively rare. It's a pretty small percentage, that's all you do at a game company is compose. More typically, you'll be composing and doing sound design and doing some other things as well. So this is another bit of analysis of the industry. I haven't quite released this yet because I'm not done with it. It should be released in about a month, where I looked at what were I've kept track of all of the job openings in game music and sound over about the past 4 or 5 months. About 100 job listings. And looked at what are they looking for. And the vast majority have sound designer in their title. So that's kind of the primary role. That said, about a fifth of those jobs I looked at did have composition listed in the desired skills. So whether that means it's actively hands-on composition or perhaps working with composers to help get their music into a game and something like that. A little under 4% had literally the word composer in the job title, so that's still pretty small. A couple of interesting other things is that more of these job listings listed this game audio tool called Wise in their list of skills that they're looking for than, for example, listed Pro Tools, which I thought was kind of surprising as well. To be fair, a lot of these listings also just generically said experience with standard DAWs or standard audio workflows. But as far as specifically calling out tool sets, Wise was certainly very big. And almost half the job descriptions listed scripting, which is kind of a programming light that we use to actually hook sounds up into the game. So, and I can see, I think that there are some questions. What I'm going to do is hold off the questions until the end, most likely, although Andrew is making a good point that, oh wow, we have somebody from Melbourne. That's awesome, even though it's 4 in the morning. And I also noticed that Florian Anderson stated that he's been compiling game job ads since about 2019. So I'd love to share, if you can maybe share that document a little bit later. So that's what the industry kind of looks like as an employer. And again, a forthcoming proper analysis of this is going to be done on the Game Sound Con blog, probably in about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. So as far as compensation, it's kind of all over the map, but about what you would expect. Entry-level jobs for game sound designers start around 30 to 40K US. As you get into the low 6-figure salaries, those tend to correlate with titles like audio director, audio manager, or people with significant numbers of years of experience. But there is definitely, as a salaried employee of a company, this is kind of what the industry looks like right now. And again, as an employee of a company, you've got lots of cool benefits. You got a steady paycheck, 401k, bonuses, stock, vacation, medical, that whole thing. And again, if you're a composer, companies like Riot, Bungie, Blizzard, Valve, doing games like Fortnite, Valorant, Destiny 2, Overwatch, World of Warcraft, these music for these games are largely done by in-house salaried composers. Now, of course, one of the downsides of working for a company is, it's by definition, any work you do as an employee of a company is going to be fully owned by that employer. In fact, in the legal sense, it is actually authored by the employer, although companies almost always credit the individual person with the work. So you do have less control over your work, and you might be eligible for PRO payments. We'll talk about more on that in a little bit. But again, overall, there's a big wide range of roles that go into game audio now: composer, sound designer, technical sound designer, music design specialist, audio directors. There's a whole subspecialization of game audio, which is dialogue, which is very different. Game dialogue, I think the latest Star Wars game with its latest add-on brought the total number of lines of dialogue to over 317,000 lines of dialogue. By comparison, a major motion picture has about 1,800 lines of dialogue. So it's literally 2 orders of magnitude more. And spreadsheets and databases are key tools for some of these jobs. So those are some of the roles. So as the industry went from everybody's an employee, which is a very, very simple business arrangement, right? When you're an employee of a company, everything you do belongs to the company. It's very, very simple. Now, one of the challenging things about games is that games did grow up first really as a manufacturing industry. Right? Video game companies made physical arcade games that were big, and they sold them, and that was kind of their business model. Then they kind of realized, hey, we're not really a manufacturing industry, we're really a software business. And so the kinds of lawyers that looked, and business people that made arrangements for deals are kind of like, his lawyers. And then finally, we kind of realized, well, video games are kind of entertainment industry, but it still has a lot of its business and contractual roots in software manufacturing. And that means when it's time to meet the music business, you got his lawyer trying to talk to her lawyer. And they just do not understand each other. It's a different mindset. To this day, there are game company lawyers that do not understand how the music industry works and how payments get made. So that can be a very challenging thing as we're working on games. So, how does a composer or sound designer get paid? What are these contracts? What do they look like? Well, the majority of work in video games is what's known as a work for hire. And work for hire is kind of like legally almost like being an employee of the company, where what is created is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the company that hires you to do it. So for the most part, even as a freelancer, if you write music for a game, you're not going to own that music. You'll most likely get a flat project fee, and the rates for that as a composer range anywhere from free, or $100 or so, to upwards of $3,000 and more per minute of finished music. That's kind of the metric we use when it's a bad metric. There's no real good way to measure amount of music for in a game because it's so interactive and can change. But that's roughly the metric that I see in a lot of contracts is quote or payment based on per minute of finished music. And then if you're a sound designer or something, then you may have a consulting rate as well. I've seen those range from about $25 an hour to $150 and more. I know somebody who books themselves out at about $1,000 a day to do technical music design and help get others people's music into a format that the game can use it. So there's quite a bit of range there. So that's the big game work, for smaller games, there's a little bit more flexibility. And if you're working on a smaller game, you might have the ability to negotiate to keep some of the rights to your music if that's important to you. One of the reasons that you have more leverage to do that, of course, is because indie games are going to have smaller budgets. So a smaller game company may be willing to negotiate away ownership of the music in exchange for a lower upfront rate. Now, deals can also get kind of complicated with indies. You can engage in profit sharing, where maybe you do it for nothing up front, but get 5% of the net revenue from the game on every sale or something like that. So it's really kind of the Wild West once you get down into the indie games. So this again is from the Game Sound Con Audio Survey, and the composers reported that if you're working on a big game, virtually all of the game's companies own the music. So the music was composed as a work for hire. As you get smaller in scale of games, it was more likely that a composer was able to maintain ownership of the music and in fact licensed the music to the game developer. Even though it was still commissioned for the game, they licensed it to the developer for use in the game so they could maintain ownership and control. And for this chart, by the way, the work for hire percentages include music written by employees of game companies. So this isn't just freelancers, this is both employees and freelancers. So that said, a successful game's music can actually garner significant additional income for the composer, even if it's been done in a work for hire format. And that's assuming that you've actually negotiated a reasonable, a good work for hire contract, or a fair work for hire contract. So I'd like to take a couple minutes and go over a couple of things that I think can go into a good work for hire for contract for games. And I've seen all of these appear in contracts. Now, not every company will agree to every term, but for the most part, these are fairly standard, with one exception that I'll get to. So, a good work for hire contract for games will allow for the composer to participate in soundtrack or other ancillary uses. Right? If the game's music ends up in a movie trailer or is streaming as a soundtrack, it's not uncommon for a company to allow the composer to participate in that. In fact, I've seen the participation be the composer gets 100% of soundtrack royalties. But there are other ancillary uses as well. Richard Jakes tells a great story about he had done some work for a company, and a movie trailer sound editor liked the music for this game, found out that he had composed it, called him to see if he could place the music into a movie trailer he was working on. And it turns out, I think it was like a $50,000 sync fee or something like that. And turns out the game company was not interested in that. So that's, that would be losing out money because the game company did not want to give up the sync license to the movie trailer. Now, this story actually has a happy ending. It turns out Richard Jakes, after finding out that the company would not provide a sync license to the trailer company, offered to write a sound-alike of his own music. And so he quickly, in a day, whipped up a sound-alike of the track he had done, gave it to the trailer company, and was able to license to them. So, always be aware that games are a very good vehicle for a composer's exposure. Again, the fact that the music supervisor was familiar with this music because of playing video games caused him to reach out to the composer and ask for the music. So always keep that in mind. Another good work for hire contract will allow the composer to release the soundtrack on their own if the composer doesn't themselves. I believe that's what Austin Wintory did with his Journey soundtrack. Another important clause is you want to be able to use your music for self-promotion. Remember, if you do music under a work-for-hire contract, the music belongs to the game company. You don't even have the right to put it on your website unless you get essentially a grant back of license from the game company to put your music on the web for limited use, for example, for promotional use. And while you're doing that, you might also want to have the license include to let use of the game's name and artwork so that you can not only put your music on your website, but also say, yes, it was for this game, and here's the cover art for it. Guaranteed public credit. If you don't have a clause in that guarantees the game developer will give you public credit, they're not required to. Again, that's usually not a problem, but occasionally it is a problem. I know recently some of the Team Fortress 2 music was published in sheet music format, and the credit was just simply given to Team Fortress 2 Audio, or Team Fortress 2 team, and not to the individual composers. So that's something you want to look for in a good work-for-hire contract. For the larger games, you probably will want to have a contract that stipulates that musicians and recording costs do not come out of your per minute creative fee. Again, this kind of depends a little bit. If you're a composer who's doing mostly virtual instruments with a couple soloists, probably you will pay for that themselves. But if they are expecting you to go to Abbey Road and record a 50-piece orchestra, then you'll want to make sure that it's clear that that is done under a separate budget. Another interesting thing is to see if you can get them to let you collect performance royalty payments. We'll talk about performance royalties in a bit. This is the bit where Bill Gates' lawyer and Katy Perry's lawyer just do not see eye to eye, because the game industry, for the most part, still does not completely understand the music industry and how they get paid. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a pretty standard clause that it sometimes gets put into contracts. You should always try to get this in. I don't recommend making it a deal breaker. I have been literally told that this clause is literally a deal breaker, and if I wanted it in, they would have to go with somebody else. So I pulled it out in that particular case. And actually, despite the fact that any music, even work for hire, can be registered with a PRO, most video game music is not actually properly registered with the performing rights organizations. Again, we'll talk about this in a little bit. For the big games, only a third of music is registered with PROs, and for indie games it gets even smaller. So again, you may be missing out on the opportunity for some revenue, or your company may be missing out on that opportunity as well. So if you're going to be either doing music or sound design for a game or both, the best thing to assume is that your upfront payment, the amount in the contract you're getting directly from the game developer, is all the money you're going to be getting for the music for this game. I've had more than one composer over the years contact me. They composed music for a game under work for hire. They did it for a really low rate, assuming that there would be some PRO money like there is when they, maybe they scored a TV series or did some music that ended up in a motion picture, and they were accustomed to making the bulk of their income off these PRO payments. And I had to kind of, unfortunately let them know that, no, it's not anybody trying to cheat you out of anything. There just are no PRO payments for the most part in video games. I'll talk about that in a sec. So, speaking about royalties, it's complicated. And again, the term royalties can mean a lot of different things. It can mean performance payments. It can mean a composer negotiating a certain percentage of every game sold or things like that. For the purposes of the rest of this talk, when I say royalties, I'm talking about public performance royalties, the kind of thing you would normally get from ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, PRS, and so on. And probably royalties are one of the most misunderstood aspects of working in games, especially as a composer coming from more traditional media like film or television. So just as a quick review, if I'm a composer for traditional media, right, movie studio company will hire a composer, let's say Chase Bethea, and they pay them a creative fee and maybe production costs and things like that. So that's how Chase makes money doing music for a film. Of course, in addition to the money he gets from the movie company, now let's say somebody watches that movie on Netflix, or it's broadcast on ABC or HBO or something like that. Those companies, of course, are going to send money to a performing rights organization, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, PRS, and so on, for the performance royalties associated with any of the music that was put into that movie. And then, of course, the reason that these PROs exist is to then distribute performance royalties back to the composer, back to the music publisher, which is in this case is Miramax. Well, it was Miramax until Miramax's music library, I guess, was bought by Warner Chappell. So whoever owns the copyright of the music, that's the publisher share. The composer gets the writer's share, and that's really the ecosystem of the traditional market. Now for games, it's a little bit different. So now how does game composing work? So in a video game company like Fancy Fish Games will hire Chase Bethea to compose music and pay them, write them a check for creative fee, for production costs, for whatever. Now what happens when somebody plays that video game? Well, they'll send money to ASCAP, right? No. That's the piece in games that just doesn't happen. That confuses a lot of composers. In general, there are no performance royalties accrued when people play video games. And that's why, again, I'll say again, for the most part, the only money you will make when you do a video game is your upfront fee. And you're like, huh? Wait a minute, isn't that illegal? What's the scoop with that? And the issue here is that a game's music does not constitute a public performance in the normal case of somebody buying a video game and playing it. This was in part decided a few years ago in U.S. ASCAP, made it all the way up to the Ninth Circuit's Court of Appeals, and it was decided that downloads of music content does not constitute a public performance, so there's no PRO payments. So it's pretty rare for a game's music to be performed during gameplay. And you're like, but wait a minute, what about online games? It's, yeah, even for online games. Playing a game online is not the same as watching a Netflix movie online. Playing a game online is analogous to watching a DVD that you purchased, not watching a Netflix movie. We can argue whether that's correct or not. In my opinion, the court didn't understand the impact that this had on games. But that's the reason there are no royalties in video games, is because in the U.S., the legal definition of public performance is not met when people buy and play video games. Even if they download a game from the internet and play it, even if they're playing online with their friends, you think it's exactly analogous to sitting on your couch and watching Netflix, sitting on your couch and playing Destiny. They're not, unfortunately. So, but are there other ways to get royalties for game music? The answer is yeah. There still are these things called performance rights, and they do exist. And one thing that can sometimes happen is music from a game ends up in more traditional media. There was an episode of South Park a number of years ago that was basically, it's the World of Warcraft South Park episode. And a lot of music from the game was in that episode. Well, as soon as the music is not in the game but is in a more traditional piece of media like film or television, all of a sudden all of the normal performance rights issues apply. When that episode is shown on Comedy Central, that is a broadcast performance. It accrues ASCAP royalties. Concerts obviously are live. I was told by one of the PRO representatives in Canada that concerts of game music in the European Union can generate up to, for a 3,000 person concert, up to about $15,000 in performance royalties. And if that's split over a dozen different game pieces, like in a video game concert, that's $1,000 per composition. So that's pretty impressive. Game music can occasionally show up in motion pictures. Arcade game I did ended up in a crappy Sally Long movie called The Boyfriend School a number of years ago. You can hear the game's music playing. That's a public performance. I was also fortunate enough some years ago, one of a video game song I did was covered by the Pixies. It's on Spotify. That's just like any other piece of linear media outside of the game. Game music covers. This is Peter Hollins doing a cover of Assassin's Creed. That YouTube video, I think, has about 1.5 million to 2 million views. It's not Katy Perry numbers, but it's nothing to sneeze at. So anytime you put game music into a more traditional medium, there's the opportunity for performance rights there as well. There's another opportunity, and remember what I said a little bit ago that playing games wasn't a performance? Well, that's true in the US. The EU has some different laws. In the European Union, a music download, is considered part mechanical, but also part performance. And for that reason, if somebody buys a game off the internet in the European Union, the EU can consider that part public performance, and it does accrue public performance royalties. And in fact, now for various reasons, part of which is the industry is still a little bit of a mess, this is only currently the case for if somebody purchases a game on the PlayStation Network and they live in a European Union country. And don't ask me what happens with Brexit, I have no idea. So for games that are downloaded to members of the EU on PlayStation, that will accrue performance royalties and through international agreements between different PRO organizations, those royalties can eventually make their way back to U.S. composers. And I know of an example of a very, very successful game. About 2 or 3 years later, after the game shipped, the composer got a pretty nice 6-figure check for all of the PlayStation performance royalties. So it is there. Now, so there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that a lot of the major publishers are kind of finally starting to get music publishing. So Bill Gates' lawyers have talked to Katy Perry's lawyers long enough that they kind of understand how this works now. And some companies are actively embracing PROs, and because they understand that their game soundtracks, the music in their games, have an inherent business value to them, just like a patent. You know, a game soundtrack has it's tangible, monetizable value. The bad news is that some game companies are actively shunning PROs and the music business ecosystem. I have firsthand experience of this. Was working on a game. I hired a composer to do a quick song. I forgot if I was out of town or something. I couldn't do it, so I got them to do it. They got paid their full upfront fee, work for hire, no problem. Upon learning that the composer was a member of a performing rights organization, they said they couldn't use the music in their game. And this company has since moved to only having employees of game companies, employees of their company themselves create music for their game. So they started hiring in-house composers because they wanted to avoid some of the PRO issues that were there. So it's a little confusing, and some good and some bad going on. So we got about 5 or 8 minutes left. Okay, good. So I did want to talk a little bit about YouTube, because it's kind of related to PROs as well. YouTube is pretty big in the music industry. I think they paid the music industry $3 billion in 2019. So how does that affect video games and the business of how that works? So let's look at a quick, oversimplified version of how you can make money as a musician on YouTube. Right? Suppose I'm Chase and I write some music. I'm actually going to tell YouTube, hey, YouTube, I own this music. And you can do that directly with Content ID if you're big enough. Otherwise, there are a number of companies that will do that for you, like AdRev and so on. And that registers your music. It signifies, yep, this is my music. Then what happens if somebody watches a video on YouTube that happens to have your music in it? What'll happen? An ad will pop up. We've all seen these. When the ad pops up on a YouTube video, it means the YouTube video has been what's called monetized, meaning that somebody is reaching out for a little piece of money when somebody watches this video. That money goes to YouTube. YouTube then says, oh, wait, I noticed that the music in this video has some of the music that Chase told me was his, so I'm going to give him some money. In addition, YouTube will probably also send some money to PROs that they've licensed, which also may end up with some money for Chase, as well as the publisher of the music. And this is a very simplified version of what goes on for a standard piece of music that somebody happens to use in a YouTube video. This is the YouTube ecosystem. So how does this affect game music? Well, there are a couple things, right? We've got game soundtracks, which are the recordings of music. And, for much of YouTube, it's very much like this. But there are these other things called Let's Play videos, and that kind of complicates things in something that's already complicated to begin with. So if you're not familiar, a Let's Play video is kind of a narrated game playthrough. And these are surprisingly popular. There are Let's Play videos that have tens of millions of views. The popular of the people who do this are called streamers. The popular streamers have millions of followers and make a lot of money. Clearly, if somebody plays a video game, narrates over the top of it, and throws that on YouTube or does it in real time on Twitch or something like that, it's clearly a public performance. Even by US v ASCAP, it's clearly public performance. It's also clearly a music sync to picture. So public performance royalties are needed, or licenses are needed. A sync license is going to be needed. But there's a bit of a problem. Obviously, the Let's Play video might be monetized. That means an ad comes up, and some of the revenue that would have gone to the creator of that video instead goes to other copyrighted content that YouTube has determined is in that video. And that's not just music. That's, it could be sound effects, it could be visual images, it could be, trademark images, things like that. And the issue is the game publisher probably does not want that to be monetized. Because they don't want some of that revenue to be stripped away from the YouTuber, from the streamer, because it's going to tick that streamer off. They have created this following, they put up this video, and all of a sudden half of their revenue is being siphoned off to somebody who's claimed copyright on it. Makes sense, because that's taking some of their money. So the streamer isn't too happy about that. Now the problem is that the developer, which is your client, the developer is the person that paid you the money to create the music, does not want to tick off the streamer. They want to actually make them happy because they're thrilled that a popular YouTube streamer is streaming this for their game. They certainly consider it marketing, public relations dollars. They want their game to be in front of people. That drives sales. So there's this dichotomy between what's you would legally be in your right to do, which is to, assuming you own the music, you can't do this if it's a work for hire, but if you own the music, you would be within your rights to try to monetize it. But that will almost certainly not please your client that you're doing so. And actually streamers have kind of thrown up their hands on this. A lot of the time streamers will simply mute the music when they're doing live streams these days, because they've learned that if they don't, that some of their revenue might get siphoned off. So it's this kind of balancing act we have to be careful of. You want to be very careful and deliberate when you mix your YouTube rights to claim and monetize content when you're doing game music. Don't just automatically throw everything you do up into ad rev if some of that work was done specifically for a game developer. And in fact, it's so crazy that YouTube actually has in its content guidelines that it puts restrictions on video game soundtracks and only lets them be used for Content ID when they're owned by the video game's publisher. So even if you as the composer own the music, it's technically out of policy for YouTube to let you claim it. So that's totally bass-ackwards, and there are multiple lawsuits, but that's kind of where it is. So summarizing YouTube, it's kind of a mess, or to be more more generous, the details haven't quite been worked out yet. So in the last couple minutes, I wanted to whip through real quickly a couple of other aspects of video game music business, just to make you be aware of. One thing that video games have become actually is an avenue for people to discover music. This is Steve Schnurr, worldwide head of music for Electronic Arts. He's been very passionate advocate about getting indie artists into video games as a mechanism for promotion. He likes to call video games the next radio stations. That's a whole nother swath of video game challenges. I licensed some music into a game that I did a couple of years ago, so a bunch of indie bands, and there were a bunch of special contract clause terms that we had to deal with because of particularly YouTube and things like that. But it's a great opportunity for artists to become recognized. Game cover remixes are big. This is people doing covers of their own versions of popular video game songs. Some of these videos and views have millions of views. They're live concerts. It's a large and growing industry. Sheet music arrangements, think of Destiny music for marching band or Mario for easy piano. There are record labels that specialize in video game music publishing and rights administration because it's pretty complicated. There are live events within games. This is Travis Scott. It's not really Travis Scott, but that's how he looked when he was giving a live performance inside the video game Fortnite to over 12 million people. Minecraft has this cute event called Block by Block West. This is Reggie Watts appearing live in Altspace VR in a virtual reality space. So there's lots of interesting ways, that the music and video game industries have kind of been coming together. And in fact, there's one very popular act that was just created out of whole cloth by a video game company, KDA. They're a K-pop group that is purely created out of thin air by Riot Games for League of Legends. Their music video Pop Stars hit 100 million views in its first month and was only the 4th K-pop girl to do that and only the 5th female act overall to be #1 on Billboard's World Digital Song Sales chart. So that's kind of going the entire gamut where now video games have just created music artists out of the blue. So in summary, we're just about on time. Wow. Game music and sound design is a lot of surface area. Sound designs are mostly done by employees or work for hire contracts. Game music usually doesn't generate PRO income. Make sure you negotiate a good work for hire. And it's really an evolving industry with lots of new business challenges, lots of cool opportunities. And it's one of the reasons that I always get excited about games in general. It's just as a continually changing industry that is just really, really fun to work in and be a part of. Oh, one more thing. Game music on YouTube is a total mess. So with that, I'm going to, first of all, thank the Help Network for hosting this webinar. And I will open it up for questions if people have questions. Now, I don't believe I have the ability to actually see people's hands raised and things like that. But I can see the webinar chat. And I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Oh, now I can see questions. Andrew Ryan, how vital is Pro Tools specifically if you want to get into game audio as well as game music as opposed to Reaper, Logic, Cubase, etc.? That's a really good question. Obviously, for the main music industry, Pro Tools is kind of the thing. I would say it's not essential. It's not essential specifically. Reaper actually is increasingly popular in video games, and one of the reasons is that Reaper is a much more programmable or customizable system. And there are, for example, software extensions you can get for Reaper that allow you to do things like export data directly from Reaper into some of these other game audio tools that there are out there, such as Wise or Fmod and things like that. That's a good question. Yeah, it's and the survey. I can actually bring up the raw survey data here because I tracked Reaper mentions as well as Pro Tools mentions. So 1% of the job listings over the last 4 months mentioned the term Reaper, compared to what I say Pro Tools was about 38%. So not too different. Yeah, it's a good question. I do not have a downloadable handout, Dominique, but this webinar is going to be made available. So there we go. So Kyle asks, can you talk more about technical composers and music integration? Okay, yeah, technical composers, it's a very interesting bit, and this is something that really doesn't exist in traditional music for film or TV. The act of getting music into a format for video games is not super straightforward. Again, one of the challenges we have in game music is that unlike in a motion picture, right, the timeline is always perfectly linear and is always exactly the same. In games, we don't really know what's going to happen, or we know what might happen, but we don't know when it's going to happen. And there are tools, FMOD and WISE are the more popular ones. There's also Fabric, CRI, Elias. These are tools that let you create music in a way, or create is the wrong word, that let you format music that you've created in such a way that it can easily morph from section to section in a musically interesting way, but still adapt to what's going on. And so the role of a technical composer is twofold. One is to work with the composer on what you might call the analogy, and that's what's analogous to spotting a movie. In other words, where should the music play? What should it be doing? How can it get from one to the other? What's technically possible? And then to work with the composer to help them understand how they need to deliver the music to you as a technical composer or a music integrator, that you can then put the music into the proper format into these tools that lets it be morphable. And so, again, it's a very, very interesting gig if you kind of like this balance of sort of nitty-gritty, hands-on technical stuff with the bigger picture, aesthetic, creative things. So yeah, that's a great question. It's a very fun field. If you look at some tutorials on WISE, WWISE, they have a tutorial on how to do that for WISE. There are tutorials for FMOD. The Unreal team also has information on sort of how these sort of things work. So could I talk about the delivery time frame for AAA projects which take many years? Yeah, that's a super great question. And it really varies a lot from studio to studio. In some cases, the music will be done by the composer that is an employee of the company, like I said. In fact, when Marty O'Donnell did the music for Destiny, he actually created a full soundtrack. It was called Music of the Spheres, which kind of foresaw the next 10 years of the whole product. So in that case, that's working well in advance to release. More commonly, if a large game is hiring a composer as a freelancer, the composer will be brought in a little bit later to the game, but not nearly as late as they do in film. So, maybe it's the last few months of the game that the composer is doing most of their work, or they do some initial meetings for ideas and sketches, and then maybe work with the music integrator or the technical composer to figure out how to best lay out recording sessions, and then do the sessions from there. But again, the big change from movies is that the act of getting into the game is non-trivial. So You can't just finish the music, a month before the game is going to ship and you're done. It does take a longer process, but usually not as long as the entire game itself. As a freelance sound designer, I own the license to some sound libraries. Should I disclose this to new content so that whether there are pieces of sound effects that they cannot use beyond the contracted project? Yes, absolutely. If you're a freelance sound designer and you're doing work in what's otherwise a work for hire contract, you explicitly need to carve out and say, these things I am not delivering under work for hire. These things I'm licensing to you. Maybe there are some things that you are doing under work for hire, but these things you specifically are not. It's actually a bit of a problem that a lot of work for hire contracts are a little bit looser than they should be. And so you will have a sound, and this pops up, by the way, if a composer sound designer, let's say, signs a license to do a small game, and maybe they're doing everything, the music and the sound design, and it's a work for hire contract, but some of the sound effects that are delivered under that contract are, let's say, from a sound ideas library. Well, if you have a sound ideas library, you do not have permission from Sound Ideas to deliver assets created with that under a work for hire. So it can be a little bit of a monkey wrench in contract negotiations. But again, especially if you own the license for those libraries, you should make it clear in the contract that the sound effects are not being delivered as work for hire. Or perhaps, it's very, very rare in games that you just take a WAV file and deliver that as a sound effect in games, right? You typically will mix it with a bunch of other sounds or customize it or put it through some weird effects. And maybe for a game you could specify that, yes, if I've morphed my sounds, and then given you the aggregate morph that's specific to your project and it's carefully synchronized to your animation, then yes, that's a work for hire. But the underlying elements to it, you have to make sure that those are not work for hire. That's a good question. Florian also just put into the chat window, there's a large compilation of articles. Yeah, I just saw this as well. It's great. On getting into game audio. And so it's at bit.ly/get_into_game audio. So I don't know how much of this chat gets saved with the Zoom feed. But yeah, bit.ly/get_into_game audio. Oh, I've been told by the Help Network that it does get saved, so you can reference this later. Any other questions? Antonio asks, just starting out in video game world and taking part in indie games. Should I copyright all the songs before sending them to developers? Also, do you think that printing watermarks on Spectral View is a good idea to protect your work? First of all, we should talk about what you mean by copyright the songs. In the US and most other countries these days, simply the act of putting them into tangible medium is copyrighting it. So the work is copyrighted automatically. Now there's a difference between having a work that is copyrighted, which they all are, and registering that copyright with the government, which you need to do. There's some advantages to doing that. I would say you don't need to. I think it's like $35 a song or something like that to do that. So you certainly can. As far as printing watermarks, most people I've talked to have recommended that's not necessarily so worth the effort. It is a way of establishing that you owned it, which I suppose if you've registered the copyright or even simply put it on your own website on a certain date, it establishes that it at least existed there at that time. But yeah, it becomes one of those things where it's you have to weigh the cost and effort of protection versus what it is that you're protecting. I mean, the fact is that once music is out on the internet, people are going to copy it, and you can try to, scramble and tamp down every illegitimate use, or you can sort of go the YouTube route and say, well, people are going to use it, but I just want to monetize it instead. So yeah, your own choice on that one, but most people I've talked to who have a big library have not bothered watermarking their content. Andrew says, do you think that the best interactive game sound and music is a sort that get noticed or not noticed? Yes, if it makes sense. I know complete what you mean. Sometimes when we do our job really well with interactive music, it takes a lot of work to do it. It's many more hours than it is to do a straight linear score. And there's a great quote by Michael Land, who I think when they were doing, what was the game? Monkey Island for LucasArts. They had a very elaborate interactive music scheme. And I believe he said there were 162 different transitions, which a transition in game music is something where if I'm in piece A, but the player does something that now means I need to change the intensity of the music. A transition is just what it sounds like. It's a little piece of music custom written to go from that piece of music to the other piece of music. And you may actually have different transitions depending upon where you are in that first piece of music that lead you to the second piece of music naturally. And again, he said that there were 162 that they did in Monkey Island, and that everything worked beautifully and it was smooth, and as you played, it was as when you're playing and watching somebody play the game, it was almost as if the game appeared to be scored as if there was only one possible way to play through it. The gamer played through it that way, and the score was written just for that. And that's really what our goal is creatively as game composers. We want to give the illusion that there's this non-linear thing where we don't know what's going to happen or how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. But in that one time the game player plays through it and creates that one experience, it's as if we scored ahead of time knowing what they were going to do. And he's joking around with Clint Bajakian and Peter McConnell about reminiscing doing that. And the phrase that stuck out was, yeah, we're not doing that again. It was just so much work, and it just didn't get noticed. So it is possible that it cannot get noticed. That said, Monkey Island is one of those games that people are remastering, they're redoing the soundtrack too and stuff. So good music will get recognized, even if maybe the detailed, intricate analysis or interactive implementation might not be so much. So personally, if a game, this is Dominique's personal opinion, I believe, if a game dev doesn't want to pay you for the music, either they're stooped or greedy. Any gamer knows it's all about the music. Yeah, it is. Music is an extremely important part of games, and the professional developers know that. The big companies know it. Blizzard Blizzard. Their composers fully partake in PRO royalties. They're savvy enough to register with ASCAP and so on, so that when the South Park episode did occur, I'm sure everybody made a lot of money on the streaming royalties or performance royalties for that South Park episode, for example. But again, just where they're coming from, the roots of video games is kind of the software industry, the software business, and this notion of right? If you're a game programmer and you invent some cool technique that the game company can patent, that patent's going to belong to the game company, and maybe the programmer will get a bonus for creating a patent, but they won't get lifelong revenue from that patent. That goes to the game company. And so that's the mindset where the game companies came from, and they just don't understand this notion of a composer providing value to the work, makes the work better. It's a business value asset of itself. It can stand out separate from the game. And so, the game, it's getting better, but a lot of game companies still don't quite get that, unfortunately. So, if there are no more questions, again, I'd like to thank the Help Network. A lot of the references, some of the data is from the Game Sound Con. I do an industry survey every year or every other year, and a lot of the other data, the analysis of the game audio job listings will be up on the Game Sound Con on our blog, probably again within a couple of weeks. So again, thanks so much for attending, and look forward to seeing you all out there in the industry.